Please excuse this, but I have not been at my best lately. But I needed to get this book read and reviewed and recorded, and I couldn't get myself together enough to do anything about this. You know what? We don't come here for this. We come here for this. So, yeah. Today is The Mind Reader by R.L. Stine. I've decided I can't review any more R.L. Stine books. They're so easy to get through, but they don't meet expectations. And I'm tired of ruining my favorable impressions of these books. So I've read and reviewed quite a few of his things, and this one was by far the best, but I had intended on reviewing some more, and I just can't do it. It's not worth my time, and I don't think it's worth your time either, because really, how many of you are reading R.L. Stine books anymore anyways? I just thought they were great for my Halloween lineup. That said, let's jump into The Mind Reader. Our main character is a girl named Ellie Anderson, and she has recently moved back to Shadyside. And the first thing that struck me, and this is just something over and over and over, which is another reason I can't keep rereading these books and reviewing them, is there's such an underdevelopment in these novels. So she claims that she was born in Shadyside and she moved when she was like 2 or 3. But she's glad to be back. She's like 17. Why is she glad to be back? She was barely there. Anywho, she has recently moved back to Shadyside, and her new best friend is this girl named Sarah. They have bonded over the fact that neither one of them has a mother. Ellie's mother was murdered when she was a young one. The one thing that we do learn about Ellie is that she's still suffering from a recent breakup. It happened because she has visions, hence The Mind Reader. She'd had visions of her boyfriend and her best friend together, even though they both denied it. This whole vision thing she couldn't let go of, and he ended up breaking up with her. This was problematic for me because we never really know if something was going on with the best friend and the boyfriend. It's really like a pinch point of sorts to set up for a new romantic interest, and Ellie having trust issues and Ellie's desire to not let her visions interfere anymore. Were the visions true or not? We don't know. It's very ambiguous, and so while it's a small thing, it's just a small thing that adds up to a lot of big things after a while. I wish that had gone about in a different way. Needless to say, we open with her at the coffee shop where Sarah is working, and this really cute guy walks in. Sarah goes on over to wait on him, and she comes back and she has all the details. Basically that his name is Brian Tanner. But can I say, there's this one moment that I thought was really funny in like the worst kind of way, because it shows how this writing just did not age well. Ellie sees this guy walk in. We're getting the assessment as to what he looks like. Ellie sipped her soda. She could hear Sarah talking to the guy. When he answered, his voice sounded soft and warm. What a cool guy, Ellie thought. I mean, I know I have been sick, but what a cool guy. Oh my gosh, I need to go back to bed. But now she just has this irrational fear of him, and she can feel him staring at her, so she jet sets out of the restaurant. And then the next time that she sees Sarah, Sarah's like, yeah, he didn't wait very long after you left either. And I'm like, is this not weird? I mean, I know it's not supposed to be normal. It's an R.L. Stine book, but the rational writer side of my brain is like, can we please flesh things out a little? His characters are guilty of irrational behavior, and it drives me absolutely crazy. So Ellie, she goes home and she decides, let's take the dog for a walk. So she takes her dog Chaz, and for once, she is not living on Fear Street. She lives on some normal street. However, she does take him into Fear Woods. She's hanging out on a rock while he's doing what he does, only for him to bring a leg bone up to her. And she's like, That's a really big bone. And the next thing she knows, he's dug up an entire grave. She freaks out, gets these people to take her to the police station. The police officer is Sarah's dad, so Lieutenant Wilkins. They're like, are you pulling our leg? She goes, no, I'm not pulling your leg. She takes him there and she starts to worry that maybe what she saw was a vision and she'll never be able to find this grave again because now it's nighttime. Well, no, she is, with the help of a vision, able to find the grave. Now it's a big hullabaloo. She insists on staying there because her dad works nights, so there's nobody that's gonna be home anyways, but she's like, I need to stay here. So they're like, sure, fine, whatever. Sarah shows up. They see Brian across the way and he's acting all shady there one minute, gone the next. But the police, they pull out a scrap of red fabric and Sarah absolutely freaks out. Next day, they're at school, but Sarah's not there. And this is when Ellie learns that Sarah had an older sister named Miranda who had disappeared a couple years earlier. She's like, what in the world? Sarah had an older sister named Miranda? Like, why didn't anybody tell me? She cannot track Sarah down. She goes to the house, she calls, she goes to work. Sarah is not there. Lieutenant Wilkins shows up at work and he is telling the boss, hey, she's at her aunt's, and Ellie's like, she has an aunt? Now she's seen Brian all over the place. They're having these really weird run-ins. She's having all these visions of Miranda, but at the same time, she's kind of having visions of her mother. Her father knows that she has visions, but he refuses to acknowledge and or speak of the fact that she has visions. But what we do learn is that her mother had been murdered here in Shadyside because she had helped the police track down a murderer of some young girl. Now Ellie is like, well, is my mother trying to communicate with me? Is Miranda trying to communicate with me? She keeps having this vision of a bloody knife, particularly when she's around Brian, but she's just creeped out by Brian. At some point, she is walking to this coffee shop and he's like, hey, let me give you a ride. Actually, what happened was she works at the library. Runs into him at the library and he's like, I can't find a book. Can you help me find the book? She goes to help him find the book. The book is not there, but there is a bloody knife. She freaks out. Turns out the knife was a vision. And for me, I'm just like, you're in a library and you are screaming your head off. Nobody in this library, I mean, Brian is wondering if she's okay, but nobody in this library is like, hey, shh. Like, you're in a library, like the librarian does not come over to make sure you're okay to see what the ruckus is about. Those are those things that R.L. Stine just forgets to put in his novels. She says, I'm getting out of here. This Brian dude, something's up with him. He drives up behind her and she has realized that he called to her as she was running away from him and he used her name and she had never given him her name. So he rolls up behind her and he's like, where are you going? Let me give you a ride. She says, that's fine, it's right there. And she takes off running. I get it. Dude creeps you out. But before we know Brian's secret, you can't help but wonder, why does he continue to approach and or pursue her when she obviously is not giving him friendly signals? She's at the cafe, coffee shop, whatever it is. And who do you think shows up? Brian. He's like, hey, let's have a meal. I'll take you home. They're eating and then Lieutenant Wilkins shows up and the next thing we know, Brian has pieced out. And I'm just like, the people in these books, they what? Ellie is consumed with her visions, consumed with what happened to Miranda, consumed with, hey, what's going on with Sarah? She does end up tracking Sarah down to her house, and Sarah is a hot mess. We realize there is a huge distinction between Sarah and Miranda. Sarah, her room is bare bones. Miranda, her room is decked out, obviously well loved, super popular. So we're wondering what's going on between the two girls and then what happened to Miranda. Who killed Miranda? The theory is that Miranda's boyfriend, Brett Hawkins, was the one who had killed her. But Brett has disappeared and we have no idea where he is. I'm sorry, I keep calling her Miranda. Her name is Melinda. I don't know what's wrong with me. Actually, I do. I should be in bed. That's what's wrong with me. Let me gather my bearings. Brian convinces Ellie to go on a date with him. Anyways, they go on this date to the lake, and he pulls out this knife to start peeling an apple, and Ellie's like, that is the knife. He's like, isn't it cool? My grandfather gave it to me. His grandfather used to be a cop, so there we go. His grandfather gave him a cool cop knife. They're in the boat, and the dog is there too, and she starts flipping out on him for some reason. And she stands up, and this kind of sets the dog off. The dog stands up and kind of overbalances the boat. She falls in. The next thing we know, something is tugging on her leg and she's about to drown, only for her then to break the surface, and she sees Brian kind of floating face down a little bit further away, and a fisherman is coming to help. She brings Brian to safety. They both survive. It's just a really weird date. He's all like, well, you saved me when I was supposed to save you. And she's like, what do you mean you're supposed to save me? She sees a picture of Melinda and Brett. She realizes that Brett is actually Brian. Somewhere along these lines, she's trying to avoid Brian. She goes to Sarah's. Sarah's like, don't you get it? I killed Melinda. And the one thing that R.L. Stine does both well and terribly is he has great cliffhangers. We end with Sarah declaring that she's the murderer, only for her not to actually be the murderer. She just feels like she was the murderer. And this is what Stine does terribly, is he likes to backtrack on his statements so that he can have a very strong end statement, but because he has such a lack of development through his storytelling, in the end, it's nonsensical and unnecessary. What really is the thing is that Sarah hated Melinda because Melinda was the golden child. Their father loved Melinda more. He did not like that Melinda was dating Brett because essentially Brett, he didn't feel was good enough for Melinda. But Sarah said anything to get Melinda out of my hair. So when Melinda and Brett decide to run away together, she says, let me help you. They decide to meet up at the mall at a certain place and time, only for the dad to call and say, he's coming home early, let's take my girls out for pizza. Well, obviously this throws a wrench in the mix. Sarah runs off to tell Brett there's a change of plans, and then when she returns to the house, Melinda is gone. Brett is never heard from again. She believes that Brett murdered her because she didn't want to run off with him, or who knows what, but her part in all of this caused Melinda's death. Ellie then has a vision. She's like, we've got to go to the grave because there's something buried in the grave. They get out there only for Brian/Brett to show up. What is in the grave is a button. Ellie hands it to Sarah, and then Brian shows up and he's like, did you find it? Do you have the button? He's looking super creepy, right? He's looking super guilty. He's trying to get this button from Ellie, who's like, what button? What are you talking about? And then Lieutenant Wilkins shows up and he's ready to shoot Brian/Brett. Sarah has also grabbed the backup gun, so Sarah has a gun too, just for a little context here. As Brett is trying to defend himself and be like, I didn't do any of this, I didn't kill her, a shot goes off. But it turns out it's not Lieutenant Wilkins who shot Brett/Brian, it is Sarah who shot Lieutenant Wilkins because she realized that the button belonged to her dad. What happened? As Monk says, here's what happened. The dad had come home and caught Melinda trying to run away. He had chased her into these woods and he ended up knocking her out. So he buries her alive. The button on his coat falls off and gets buried into this grave. Oh, that reminds me. What caused Ellie to want to avoid Brian was that, so she had read, and this is something I didn't understand. So they're on their date, she sees the knife. Then she has a vision of the murder weapon knife and where it's buried. So she gets Lieutenant Wilkins. She takes him to a tree over by the grave site. She's like, it's in there. So she finds it. She pulls it out and she's like, oh my gosh, Brian is the murderer. And I'm like, but he had his knife with him earlier that day. How could his knife be buried for years at the base of this tree covered in rust and grit? Like, how could he have the same knife? Turns out the dad had stabbed Melinda. Turns out that because it's a police knife, they just had the same knife. It was an accident that he then ended up turning into a murder, and Sarah, realizing that her dad had killed Melinda, then shoots the dad. She doesn't kill him, but she does wound him. She was able to put the pieces together because for like a week or so, or maybe multiple weeks after Melinda's disappearance, her dad was freaking out about this missing button, and she could not figure out why this button was so important until this moment. And we don't really realize that Sarah knows anything because when Ellie gets the button and she shows it to Sarah, Brian/Brett appears so suddenly that the focus shifts away from Sarah and to Brett/Brian. We learn also that Ellie's mother used to have visions, and this is ultimately what got her killed because her visions helped lead her to the uncle, which then he gets arrested by the cops, but then the cops don't have enough to hold him, so they release him. He comes after Ellie's mother, who dies in front of her. I found this rather strange because she's like 2 or 3, and she has absolute perfect memories of her mother's murder. Never before has she had a perfect memory of her mother's murder, but now she does. So the mother really had nothing to do with anything, but it was there. Yeah, everything is hunky-dory. I think Sarah goes, I don't know what Sarah does because she doesn't have an aunt to go live with, but we come to with Ellie and Brett because he's like, Brian never existed. I was just on the run. She's like, how did you know all this stuff about me? Why did you say that I needed saving? How did you know my name? He's like, oh, because I've got visions too. We're coming full circle with her having lost a relationship due to her visions, but then finding her perfect mate because they both have visions. Yeah, it wasn't terrible. In terms of everything, I thought it was the most logical book that I have read of his recently, but it was very fast-paced, and there was a lot of almost like Scream Queen-ness going on with Ellie freaking out over everything without a rational explanation, and a lot of ping-ponging, in my opinion, and his characters tend to ping-pong, where they go from one emotion to another, or they go from one location to another, or they make one decision and then another. There was a lot of good stuff, but as it is not a very big book, there wasn't a lot of time to develop it. But there we go. That is The Mind Reader. Once again, thanks for sticking with me. I hope you have a great day. And because I have run out of a hefty supply of October reads, if you have any spooky, scary, Halloween-y kind of books to recommend, drop them down below. Bye.